Emma and Jacob had been inseparable during their childhood, the kind of friends who communicated without words and spent entire summers building forts, catching fireflies, and dreaming of adventures far beyond their small town. Their bond was special until life pulled them apart. Emma's family moved across the country just before middle school, leaving behind tearful goodbyes and promises to write. For a while, they did letters filled with doodles, secrets, and updates, but as years passed, the letters dwindled, replaced by the distractions of new schools, new friends, and new lives. Now, nearly 2 decades later, Emma was a freelance writer living in the city, often retreating to quiet bookshops for inspiration. Jacob, an architect, had built a career designing sustainable homes, yet he often found himself yearning for the simplicity of his past. It was a gray, drizzly Saturday when Emma ducked into her favorite bookstore, shaking off her umbrella at the door. The warm smell of coffee and old pages welcomed her, a comforting contrast to the storm outside. Wandering the aisles, she felt herself relax, fingers trailing over the spines of books. One title caught her eye, a vintage edition of her favorite childhood story, the same one Jacob used to read to her when they were kids. Smiling, she reached for it, only to feel another hand graze hers. "Sorry," she began, but her words faltered as she looked up. The man in front of her stared, his brow furrowed at first, then softening into a look of recognition. Emma, her breath caught. Jacob. They stood there for a moment, rain pattering against the windows, before Jacob gestured to the bookstore's cafe. "Do you have time to catch up?" Over steaming cups of coffee, they shared fragments of their lives. Jacob spoke of his architectural projects and his love for restoring old buildings. Emma described her writing, how she often drew inspiration from the nostalgia of their childhood. "I've thought about those days a lot," Jacob admitted, stirring his coffee absent-mindedly. "You were my best friend. No one ever came close." Emma smiled, her chest tightening. "Same here. It's strange, isn't it? How someone can mean so much, and then life just gets in the way." They reminisced about their adventures, how they'd spent an entire summer trying and failing to build a tree house, and the secret fort they'd made in the woods. When the cafe lights dimmed, signaling closing time, Jacob walked her to her car. "Let's not lose touch this time," he said, handing her his phone to exchange numbers. What started as occasional texts soon turned into daily conversations. They discovered how much they still had in common, shared tastes in music, movies, and even obscure hobbies. Jacob confessed his passion for woodworking, while Emma admitted she was trying her hand at gardening. Their first planned outing was a visit to a botanical garden. Jacob brought a sketchbook, capturing the intricate designs of the greenhouse, while Emma snapped photos for inspiration. They fell into an easy rhythm, as though the years apart had simply melted away. One crisp autumn morning, Jacob called Emma with an idea. "How do you feel about a little road trip?" "Where to?" she asked, intrigued. "Our hometown. I think it's time we revisited our old stomping grounds." The drive was filled with laughter and music from a playlist Jacob had made, full of songs they used to listen to. When they reached their childhood neighborhood, it felt both familiar and foreign. They walked through the streets, pointing out changes and sharing memories. The playground where they used to race to the swings was now updated with shiny new equipment. The creek where they caught frogs was still there, albeit smaller than they remembered. Finally, they found their way to the clearing in the woods where their secret fort had once stood. It was overgrown with ivy, the wooden boards long gone, but the memory of it was vivid in their minds. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the sky in hues of orange and purple, Jacob turned to Emma. "You know, I think fate brought us back together." Emma looked at him, a soft smile playing on her lips. "Maybe it did, or maybe we just weren't done writing our story." From that day forward, their friendship blossomed into something deeper. They became each other's safe haven in a chaotic world, finding joy in shared adventures, quiet moments, and the rediscovery of a bond that had always been there, waiting. Years later, as they sat together on the porch of a home they designed and built together, Jacob would tease Emma, saying, "All of this started with a book. Who would have thought?" And Emma, leaning her head on his shoulder, would reply, "It wasn't just a book. It was you. It's always been you." Life can change in a single moment, one phone call, one letter, one decision. That's what happened to me the day I opened that envelope. Leela had spent her entire adult life dreaming of adventure. Yet her days were filled with routine. Wake up, go to work, come home, repeat. She worked as a graphic designer, her creativity confined to the four walls of her small apartment. Every night, before bed, she'd scroll through travel blogs and Instagram accounts of people exploring turquoise oceans, rugged mountains, and cobblestone streets, longing for a taste of their freedom. But Leela was practical. Vacations were luxuries she couldn't afford. Or so she thought until the day her boyfriend, Ryan, handed her a mysterious envelope with a sly grin. "Open it," he urged, his blue eyes sparkling with excitement. "What is it?" she asked, her hands trembling slightly. "Just open it," he repeated. Inside was a glossy plane ticket to Santorini, Greece, and an itinerary for a week-long dream vacation. Leela's heart raced. "Ryan, is this real?" she whispered, her voice shaking. "Pack your bags. Leela, we leave in 3 days," he said, pulling her into a hug. The days leading up to their departure felt surreal. Leela meticulously packed and repacked her suitcase, her excitement mingled with disbelief. When the day finally arrived, they boarded the plane, and Leela found herself staring out the window as the clouds rolled by, imagining the adventure that awaited them. Santorini exceeded every expectation. The whitewashed buildings, the sapphire blue sea, and the vibrant sunsets felt like something out of a dream. Ryan had planned everything to perfection: romantic dinners overlooking the caldera, boat rides around the island, and even a private wine-tasting tour. But something about Ryan's behavior was different. He seemed distracted, checking his phone constantly and disappearing at odd times. One evening, as they strolled through the winding streets of Oya, Leela noticed Ryan glance over his shoulder for the third time in 10 minutes. "Ryan, is everything okay?" she asked, stopping to face him. "Yeah, of course," he said, flashing her a reassuring smile, but she wasn't convinced. The next day, while Ryan was supposedly running errands, Leela decided to do a little exploring on her own. As she wandered through the market, admiring handmade jewelry and local crafts, she spotted a man in a navy blazer lingering nearby. He wasn't browsing or shopping, he was watching her. Feeling uneasy, Leela ducked into a crowded cafe, hoping to lose him. But when she glanced out the window, there he was, standing across the street, his eyes fixed on her. When Ryan returned to the hotel that evening, Leela confronted him. "Ryan, are you hiding something from me? There's this guy ... I feel like we're being followed." Ryan's face turned pale. What did he look like? Leela described the man, and Ryan cursed under his breath. "I didn't want to tell you, but there's something I need to explain." He led her out onto the balcony, away from prying ears. "Remember when I said this trip was a surprise? Well, it's not entirely true. This isn't just a vacation, Leela. It's a test, she repeated, her voice rising. Ryan took her hands. "Leela, I've been working undercover for the past year. That man you saw, he's part of the mission. We're here to meet someone who has information we need. I couldn't tell you before, but now that he's shown up ... I need you to trust me." Leela felt like the ground had been pulled out from under her. The man she thought she knew was suddenly a stranger. But, as much as she wanted to be angry, a part of her was intrigued. "What do you need me to do?" she asked, surprising herself. That night, they attended a lavish gala at an exclusive villa. Ryan introduced Leela as his fiancée, their cover story. Leela played along, her heart pounding as she mingled with the other guests, keeping an eye out for the man in the navy blazer. As the evening progressed, Ryan slipped away to meet his contact. Leela kept her composure, but when she saw the man in the blazer approaching her, her pulse quickened. "Ms. Leela," he said smoothly, his accent thick. "A pleasure to meet you. I think you have the wrong person," she replied, trying to sound calm. "Ah, but you are with Mr. Ryan?" "Yes, and you know more than you let on." Before she could respond, Ryan appeared at her side. "Step away from her," he said coldly. The man smirked. "Careful, Mr. Ryan. You wouldn't want to make a scene." Ryan escorted Leela out of the villa, his hand gripping hers tightly. They hailed a cab and sped away, leaving the glittering lights of the gala behind. Back at the hotel, Ryan explained everything. The man in the blazer was a double agent, and the information he had just obtained could prevent a major security breach. Leela listened intently, her fear giving way to admiration. "You didn't have to bring me into this," she said quietly. "I didn't want to," Ryan admitted, "but I also couldn't leave you behind. I wanted this to be our dream vacation, Leela, and I promise, after this, it will be." The next day, they boarded a private boat and sailed to a secluded beach. For the first time since the trip began, Leela felt a sense of peace. The danger was behind them, and in its place was a deeper bond forged by trust and courage. As they watched the sun dip below the horizon, Ryan pulled Leela close. "I meant what I said, you know, about this being our dream vacation. You've always been my dream, Leela." Tears filled her eyes as she smiled. "And you've always been mine." For the first time, Leela felt truly alive, ready to embrace whatever adventure life had in store for them together. They say time is the most precious gift you can give, but for me, it was the one thing I was running out of. Maya stood in the middle of her living room, staring at a box wrapped in silver paper with a crimson bow. It had been delivered that morning with no note, no sender, just her name written in elegant cursive. She hesitated, her hands trembling as she untied the bow. Inside was a sleek, antique pocket watch. The metal gleamed under the light, and the intricate design on its surface seemed almost alive. As she picked it up, the second hand froze, and a shiver ran down her spine. Maya's life was anything but extraordinary. A high school history teacher, she spent her days juggling lesson plans and late-night grading sessions. She lived alone, her world a monotonous cycle of work and solitude. So, the sudden arrival of the watch felt out of place like a crack in the predictable rhythm of her life. When she wound the watch's mechanism, a strange sensation washed over her, as if the air had thickened. She glanced at the clock on the wall. It was still ticking, but the second hand was moving backward. "What the?" she whispered, holding the pocket watch closer. Suddenly, her phone buzzed. It was a notification for an event she didn't remember scheduling. "Meet at the old oak tree, 3 p.m. Don't be late." Maya's heart raced. She hadn't been to the oak tree in years, not since her father passed away. It had been their favorite spot, a place filled with memories of storytelling and laughter. But who could have sent the message? At exactly 3 p.m., Maya stood beneath the sprawling branches of the old oak tree, clutching the pocket watch. The air was eerily still, and the autumn leaves crunched underfoot. She looked around, expecting to see someone. "Hello," she called out, her voice echoing. Then she saw a small wooden box buried beneath the roots. Digging it out with trembling hands, she opened it to find a photograph of her father, holding the very same pocket watch. On the back of the photo was a handwritten note. "Time is not linear. Follow the moments you've lost." Before she could process the message, the pocket watch in her hand began to hum, the second hand spinning rapidly, the world around her blurred, colors and shapes blending together, until everything went black. When Maya opened her eyes, she was standing in her childhood home. It was Christmas Eve, and the scent of pine and gingerbread filled the air. She could hear her father's laughter in the next room. Her heart clenched. This was the last Christmas they had spent together before his sudden death. She walked into the living room, and there he was alive, smiling. He didn't seem to hear her, continuing to hang ornaments on the tree. It was as if she were a ghost in this memory, unable to interact. The watch in her hand vibrated, pulling her attention to its face. The hands were moving again, this time pointing toward the front door. Reluctantly, she followed the pull. As she stepped through the door, the world shifted once more. Maya found herself in her college dorm room, surrounded by textbooks and notes. She recognized this day was the night she had a huge fight with her best friend, Clara. They had been inseparable until that argument tore them apart. She saw her younger self pacing, tears in her eyes as she typed an angry message to Clara. Maya wanted to scream, to tell her past self to stop and call Clara instead. But all she could do was watch as the younger Maya hit send, sealing the rift between them. The watch buzzed again, and the scene began to dissolve. Stop after stop, Maya was taken to moments she had long buried in her memory. Her first heartbreak, the job opportunity she didn't take, the goodbye she didn't say. Each scene brought a mix of joy, pain, and regret. By the time she was pulled back to the present, Maya was emotionally exhausted. She sat under the oak tree, clutching the pocket watch, trying to make sense of it all. Then she noticed something she hadn't before. The back of the watch had an engraving, "One more chance." The watch's hands began spinning wildly, and Maya was thrust into another scene. This time, it wasn't a memory, it was the future. She stood in a hospital room, watching herself sit beside an elderly woman. It was Clara. Her former best friend looked frail, her breath shallow. Maya watched as the older version of herself leaned in and whispered, "I'm sorry. I should have never let us drift apart." The scene broke her heart. She realized this was a warning, a glimpse of what would happen if she didn't act now. When Maya returned to the present, she didn't hesitate. She grabbed her phone and called Clara. The line rang for what felt like an eternity before her friend picked up. "Maya." Clara's voice was hesitant, but familiar. "Clara, I'm so sorry. For everything. Can we meet and talk? Please." There was a long pause, and Maya held her breath. "Okay," Clara said finally. In the days that followed, Maya and Clara reconnected, mending their fractured friendship. Maya also began taking risks she had always avoided, pursuing her dream of writing, traveling to places she'd only imagined, and embracing life with an open heart. One evening, as she sat under the oak tree with Clara, she looked at the pocket watch one last time. The hands were still, the hum gone. It had served its purpose. Maya smiled, realizing the gift wasn't just about revisiting the past, it was about learning from it and embracing the time she still had. Love isn't measured by the years you've spent together, but by the battles you've fought and the promises you've kept. Claire stood in front of the mirror, smoothing the wrinkles out of her pale blue dress. It wasn't a wedding gown, but it felt just as special. Today was their vow renewal, a celebration of 25 years of marriage. Yet, as she glanced at the clock, a wave of unease washed over her. James was late. Her husband was rarely late for anything, and on a day as important as this, it felt strange. She grabbed her phone and dialed his number, but it went straight to voicemail. "James, where are you?" she whispered, trying to shake off the growing anxiety. Claire paced the living room, her mind racing. Their children were already at the ceremony venue, waiting for their parents to arrive. She had to leave soon, but how could she go without James? Just as she was about to call again, her phone buzzed. A text message appeared on the screen. "Come to the park where we first met, alone. Don't tell anyone." The message wasn't signed, but she knew it was from James. Her heart raced. Why would he ask her to come alone? Was this some kind of romantic surprise, or was something wrong? Grabbing her coat, Claire hurried out the door. The park hadn't changed much in 25 years. The benches were the same, the trees just a little taller, and the air still carried the faint scent of wildflowers. This was where it had all started, where James had spilled his coffee on her, sparking an apology that turned into a conversation, and eventually a love story. But today, the park felt different, quiet, too quiet. She spotted a small envelope pinned to the bench where they had first sat together. Her name was written on the front in James's familiar handwriting. With trembling hands, she opened it. Claire, love is built on trust, even in the moments that test it most. Follow the path we walked that first day, and you'll find me. Claire's heels clicked against the cobblestones as she retraced their steps. Her mind replayed snippets of their life together, their whirlwind romance, the struggles of their early years, the joy of raising their children, and the times when their love was the only thing keeping them afloat. The path led her to the lake, where another envelope awaited. This one was tied to a tree branch, fluttering in the breeze. Do you remember our first fight? You stormed off, but I stayed. Love isn't about being perfect. It's about staying when things get tough. Keep going. I'm waiting. Tears welled up in her eyes. She did remember, it had been a silly argument, but it was the first time she realized James was her safe place, the one person who would never leave. As she reached the bridge overlooking the lake, Claire spotted a man in a dark coat standing at the far end. Her heart leapt. James. She called out. The man turned, but it wasn't James. Instead, it was a stranger holding yet another envelope. Mrs. Claire, the man asked. Yes, she said cautiously. He handed her the envelope with a small smile. He wanted you to have this. Claire opened it, her hands shaking. Claire, there's something I've been keeping from you. Something I should have told you sooner. But I needed today to remind you of how much I love you before we face it together. Trust me. Meet me at the clearing. Her mind spun with questions. What could James be hiding? And why today, of all days? The clearing was bathed in golden sunlight, and there, under the canopy of trees, stood James. He was dressed in a suit, a single white rose pinned to his lapel. He looked nervous, something Claire rarely saw in him. James, she said, running to him. What's going on? Why all the secrecy? He took her hands, his eyes searching hers. Claire, there's no easy way to say this, but I've been diagnosed with early onset Parkinson's. The words hung in the air, heavy and unyielding. What? She whispered, her voice cracking. I didn't want to tell you until I knew I could handle it, he said. But then I realized, I don't have to handle it alone. I have you. I've always had you. Claire's eyes filled with tears, but she didn't pull away. Instead, she wrapped her arms around him, holding him as tightly as she could. We'll face this together, she said firmly. Like we always have. As they walked back toward the park's gazebo, where their family and friends were waiting, James stopped and turned to her. Before we join everyone, I need you to know one thing, he said. No matter what the future holds, I promise to love you just as fiercely as I did the day we first said our vows. Claire smiled through her tears. And I promise to stand by you, in sickness and in health, for as long as we both shall live. When they reached the gazebo, applause erupted. Their children, friends, and family surrounded them, their love palpable in the air. James and Claire stood before the officiant, hands clasped, as they renewed their vows. This time, the promises felt even deeper, rooted in a lifetime of shared joys and challenges. As the sun set over the park, Claire and James danced beneath the twinkling fairy lights, the world fading away. Their love, though tested by life's uncertainties, had grown stronger, a testament to the power of trust, resilience, and the promises that bind to hearts together. In that moment, surrounded by the people they loved most, Claire realized that their story was far from over. It was just entering a new chapter, one they would face hand in hand. They say you never truly know someone until a crisis reveals their true colors. For me, it started with a scream in the dead of night. Emily sat up in bed, her heart racing as the faint sound of a cry pierced through the silence. It wasn't the sound of a child or a movie playing next door. It was real, raw, and filled with panic. She glanced at her clock. To 17 a.m. The sound came again, louder this time. It was coming from the house next door. She froze, unsure of what to do. Her neighbor, Mr. Grayson, was a quiet, reclusive man in his late 60s. They had exchanged polite nods over the years, but she hardly knew him. Grabbing her phone, Emily debated whether to call the police. Something was wrong, but what if she was overreacting? Summoning her courage, Emily pulled on her robe and stepped out into the chilly night. The porch light from Mr. Grayson's house flickered, casting eerie shadows on the overgrown bushes. She knocked softly on his door. "Mr. Grayson, are you okay?" No answer. Her instincts told her to leave, but something compelled her to stay. She tried the doorknob. It was unlocked. "Hello. It's Emily from next door," she called out, stepping inside. The living room was dimly lit, cluttered with old newspapers and stacks of books. The air smelled musty, and a faint trail of muddy footprints led toward the hallway. "Mr. Grayson," a low groan echoed from the back room. Emily's chest tightened. She followed the sound, her footsteps hesitant, until she reached a door slightly ajar. Inside, Mr. Grayson lay on the floor, clutching his chest. His face was pale, and beads of sweat lined his forehead. "Help, .. double quotes, he gasped. .. Emily's panic gave way to action. She knelt beside him, dialing 911 with shaky fingers. As the operator guided her through CPR instructions, she did her best to keep him conscious. "Stay with me, Mr. Grayson," she urged, pressing her hands against his chest. Minutes felt like hours, but soon, the sound of sirens filled the air. Paramedics rushed in, taking over as Emily stepped back, her hands trembling. As they loaded Mr. Grayson onto a stretcher. One of the EMTs turned to her. "You saved his life. If you hadn't acted, he wouldn't have made it." Relief washed over her, but questions lingered. What had caused this, and why had he been screaming before collapsing? The next morning, Emily couldn't shake the events of the night. She decided to visit Mr. Grayson at the hospital, bringing a small bouquet of flowers. When she entered his room, he looked surprised but grateful. "Emily," he said, his voice weak, "I didn't expect to see you." "I just wanted to check on you," she said, placing the flowers on the bedside table. "What happened last night?" He hesitated, his eyes clouded with unease. "It was a heart attack, but ... there was more to it." Emily leaned closer. "What do you mean?" Mr. Grayson glanced around as if someone might overhear. "There's something in my house, something I've been trying to ignore." Emily blinked, unsure if his words were a result of his medical condition or something deeper. "What do you mean, something?" he sighed. "It started months ago. Strange noises, things moving on their own. At first, I thought it was my imagination, but last night ... double quotes he trailed off, his hands trembling. "Last night, I saw it, a shadow. It felt like it was watching me." Emily's logical mind rebelled against the idea, but the fear in his eyes was undeniable. "Maybe it's just stress," she offered gently. "Maybe," he said, though his tone suggested otherwise. Before she left, he gripped her hand. "Please, check on the house while I'm here. I need to know if I'm losing my mind." That evening, Emily stood outside Mr. Grayson's house, armed with a flashlight and a sense of dread. She had promised to check on the place, but now that she was here, every instinct told her to turn back. The house felt colder than it had the night before. The shadows seemed to stretch and twist in ways that defied logic. As she moved through the rooms, she noticed small things: a picture frame lying face down, a faint, rhythmic tapping coming from the attic. She climbed the narrow staircase, each creak amplifying her heartbeat. When she reached the attic door, she hesitated. The tapping stopped. Taking a deep breath, Emily pushed the door open. The attic was dark, filled with old furniture and forgotten belongings. Her flashlight beam landed on an old trunk in the corner. As she approached, the air grew heavy. She opened the trunk, revealing stacks of letters and photographs. They depicted a younger Mr. Grayson with a woman and a little girl. The same faces appeared again and again, smiling in happier times, But one photo caught her attention. It showed Mr. Grayson's family, with the little girl holding a doll. Scribbled across the bottom were the words, "Goodbye, Daddy. I'll always be here." Suddenly, the attic door slammed shut. Emily spun around, her flashlight flickering. A shadow moved across the wall, and a faint whisper filled the air. Emily stumbled out of the attic, clutching the photo. The house seemed alive, groaning and creaking as if reacting to her presence. She fled to her own home, heart pounding. The next day, she returned to the hospital, determined to confront Mr. Grayson. "Who are they?" she asked, showing him the photograph. Tears welled up in his eyes. "My wife and daughter. They died in a car accident years ago. I've kept the house the same ever since. I couldn't let go." Emily hesitated. I think your daughter is still there, watching over you, a bond forged in trust." When Mr. Grayson returned home, Emily helped him clear the attic. Together, they boxed up the letters and photos, creating a small memorial in the garden. The strange occurrences stopped, and the house felt lighter, as if a burden had been lifted. From that day on, Emily and Mr. Grayson became close friends. Their bond, forged in fear and trust, reminded them both of the importance of human connection. And though neither of them ever spoke of the shadow again, Emily sometimes felt a comforting presence when she visited, a quiet reassurance that love, even in its most mysterious forms, never truly leaves. Sometimes, the smallest gestures hold the power to change lives in ways we can't foresee. For me, it all began with an umbrella on a rainy Tuesday evening. Sophie hurried down the crowded street, the rain soaking through her thin coat. Her arms were laden with grocery bags, and the wind made it nearly impossible to keep her hood in place. She was drenched, shivering, and trying not to cry. Then, out of nowhere, a red umbrella appeared over her head. "Looks like you could use some help," a warm voice said. She turned to see a man in his late 30s, holding the umbrella while wearing a kind smile. His tailored coat suggested he didn't belong in the same storm as her. "Thank you," she stammered. "It's no trouble," he replied. "Where are you headed?" Sophie hesitated. She wasn't used to strangers being so kind. "Just a few blocks down," she said finally. The man nodded. "Let me walk you. It's the least I can do." They walked in silence for a moment, the rain pattering against the umbrella. Sophie couldn't help but steal glances at him. He had an air of confidence, but there was something soft and genuine in his demeanor. "I'm Daniel, by the way," he said, breaking the silence. "Sophie," she replied. "Well, Sophie, you've officially made my day more interesting. Most people just rush past in this weather." She laughed nervously. "I guess I don't really have a choice." When they reached her apartment building, Sophie paused at the entrance. "Thank you," she said, her voice tinged with genuine gratitude. Daniel handed her the umbrella. "Keep it. I have another." "No, I can't." "I insist," he interrupted. "Consider it a small act of love for a stranger." The phrase caught her off guard. A small act of love. She nodded, clutching the umbrella as if it were a lifeline. As he turned to leave, she called out, "Maybe I'll return the favor someday." Daniel smiled. "I'll hold you to that." Life takes a turn. Days turned into weeks, and Sophie couldn't stop thinking about Daniel's kindness. She was used to struggling alone, balancing two jobs to pay rent and caring for her younger brother, Ben, who was wheelchair-bound and accident. People rarely noticed her, let alone extended a helping hand. One afternoon, while taking Ben to the park, she spotted Daniel sitting on a bench, engrossed in a book. "Daniel," she called out, surprised. He looked up, just as surprised to see her. "Sophie, what are the odds?" They struck up a conversation, and Sophie introduced Ben. Daniel was immediately warm and attentive, asking Ben about his favorite books and hobbies. A growing bond. Over the next few weeks, Sophie and Daniel began running into each other more often. Sometimes it was at the park, other times at the local coffee shop. Each encounter felt natural. As if the universe was nudging them closer, Daniel learned about Sophie's struggles, her demanding schedule, the challenges of caring for Ben, and the dreams she had put on hold. "You're stronger than you give yourself credit for," he told her one evening. Sophie scoffed. "I don't feel strong. I'm just trying to survive." Daniel leaned forward, his gaze unwavering. "Surviving is strength, Sophie. But you deserve to thrive, the storm before the calm." Just as their bond deepened, Sophie's life took another hit. Her landlord delivered an eviction notice, claiming her late rent payments had finally caught up to her. She broke down in tears that night, clutching the red umbrella Daniel had given her. She felt like she was drowning, and no amount of kindness could save her. The next day, she saw Daniel at the coffee shop. He immediately noticed her swollen eyes. "What's wrong?" he asked, concern etched on his face. Sophie hesitated but finally confided in him. "I'm being evicted. I don't know where we'll go." To her surprise, Daniel didn't offer empty platitudes. Instead, he said, "Let me help," the unexpected gesture. Daniel spent the next few days helping Sophie search for affordable housing. He even connected her with a friend who worked for a local charity, offering assistance for families in crisis. At first, Sophie felt uncomfortable accepting his help, but Daniel's sincerity made it impossible to refuse. One evening, as they finalized paperwork for a new apartment, Sophie turned to him. "Why are you doing all this for me?" Daniel smiled softly. "Because sometimes, life gives us a chance to be someone's red umbrella. And because ... I care about you, Sophie. More than I realized, a new beginning." With Daniel's help, Sophie and Ben moved into a small but cozy apartment. For the first time in years, Sophie felt like she could breathe. But Daniel didn't stop there. He became a regular presence in their lives, helping Ben with his schoolwork and taking Sophie out for coffee when she needed a break. Their friendship slowly blossomed into something deeper. Daniel's quiet strength and unwavering support became Sophie's anchor, while her resilience and determination inspired him. One rainy evening, they found themselves walking home together under a familiar red umbrella. "Funny how this all started with an umbrella," Sophie said, smiling up at him. Daniel chuckled. "Sometimes, the smallest acts of love lead to the biggest changes. A love that transforms." Years later, Sophie would look back on that rainy night and realize it was the turning point of her life. What began as a stranger's kindness had grown into a bond that weathered every storm. Daniel's small act of love didn't just shelter her from the rain, it gave her the courage to believe in herself, to dream again, and to trust in the power of human connection. And as they stood together, watching Ben take his first steps after years of therapy, Sophie knew she had found something truly rare. A love born not out of grand gestures, but out of the small, quiet moments that make life extraordinary. Sometimes, the answers we search for are hidden in places we least expect. For me, it all started with an envelope tucked away in a dusty attic. Maggie stood at the base of the attic ladder, staring at the cracked wooden panels above. Her grandmother's funeral had been earlier that day, and she was tasked with sorting through decades of family possessions. The house was eerily quiet, save for the occasional creak as the wind moved through the old structure. She hesitated, unsure if she could face the memories hidden in those forgotten boxes. But something compelled her to climb. Dust swirled in the dim light of a single bulb as Maggie pushed open the attic door. Among the stacks of faded photographs, yellowed books, and weathered keepsakes, a small wooden box caught her eye. It was unassuming, but when she opened it, she found a single envelope, addressed in her grandmother's elegant handwriting. The name on the envelope made her freeze. Margaret and Turner. It was her name, the letter. Her hands trembled as she opened the envelope. Inside was a letter, dated May 5, 1950, to over 70 years ago. "Dear Margaret, if you are reading this, it means I'm no longer there to tell you this story myself. There is something you need to know. Something I've kept hidden for decades. It's about your mother. Elizabeth, and a decision I made that changed everything. The letter ended abruptly, the ink smudged as if her grandmother had stopped mid-sentence. Maggie's heart raced. What decision? What was she hiding? She searched the box for more, but there was nothing else, a hidden trail. Determined to uncover the truth, Maggie spent the next day combing through the attic. She found old journals, photo albums, and even a stack of postcards, but nothing that answered the questions swirling in her mind. That night, as she sat at the kitchen table staring at the letter, her mother, Elizabeth, walked in. "You've been quiet since the funeral," her mother said, sitting down across from her. "What's on your mind?" Maggie hesitated. Should she tell her mother about the letter? Finally, she slid it across the table. "I found this in the attic." Her mother's face paled as she read the letter. When she finished, she looked up with tears in her eyes. "I never thought she'd tell anyone," Elizabeth whispered. "The family secret." Elizabeth took a deep breath and began to speak. "Your grandmother wasn't always the woman you knew. When I was a child, she made a choice that changed our lives forever. She left my father, your grandfather, without explanation. She told everyone he abandoned us, but that wasn't true." Maggie stared at her mother in shock. "What do you mean?" Elizabeth reached for her hand. "He wasn't the man she thought he was. She discovered something dangerous and she left to protect me." "What did she find?" Maggie asked. "I don't know. She never told me. But it haunted her for the rest of her life, a clue in the attic." Determined to uncover the truth, Maggie returned to the attic the next day. This time, she searched more carefully, running her fingers along the edges of boxes and shelves. In the back corner, hidden beneath a pile of old quilts, she found a small, locked chest. The key was nowhere to be found, so she pried it open with a screwdriver. Inside, she found a stack of letters tied with a ribbon, all addressed to her grandmother from someone named James. The handwriting was unfamiliar, and the tone was urgent. "Maggie, I know what I saw. He's not who you think he is. Please, don't ignore this. Your safety and Elizabeth's depends on it." Maggie's pulse quickened. Who was James? And who was he warning her grandmother about? The man in the photograph. Beneath the letters was a photograph of a man in a military uniform, his face stern and commanding. On the back was a single name, Arthur Reynolds. Maggie rushed downstairs and showed the photograph to her mother. Elizabeth's face darkened. "That's him. That's your grandfather." "What happened to him?" Maggie asked. Her mother shook her head. "He disappeared shortly after she left him. I always thought he ran off, but now I'm not so sure." The dark connection. Maggie decided to dig deeper. She visited the local library and searched through old newspapers. After hours of research, she found an article from 1953 about Arthur Reynolds, a decorated soldier turned businessman. The article praised him, but a follow-up piece months later hinted at accusations of corruption and ties to illegal activities. The more Maggie read, the more she realized her grandmother had been protecting her family from a man with a dangerous past. Confronting the past, that evening, Maggie and Elizabeth sat together, piecing together the fragments of the story. "She must have discovered his secrets," Elizabeth said. But why didn't she tell anyone? Maggie thought back to the letter. Maybe she thought no one would believe her. Or B, she was afraid of what he might do. They decided to visit the small cottage her grandmother had moved to after leaving Arthur. The property had been untouched for years, and they hoped it might hold more answers. The final revelation: in the dusty corner of the cottage's basement, they found a safe. Inside were more letters, photographs, and a journal. The journal detailed her grandmother's discovery of Arthur's crimes and her desperate attempt to escape him. It also revealed that James, the man who had written her the warning letters, was a private investigator and her grandmother's confidant. One final letter was addressed to Elizabeth. "My dearest Elizabeth, I made the hardest choice of my life to protect you. I hope you'll understand someday. Arthur wasn't the man I thought he was, and I couldn't risk staying. I left to give you a chance at a better life. Please forgive me. Tears streamed down Elizabeth's face as she read the letter aloud. A small act of courage. In the end, Maggie and Elizabeth chose to honor her grandmother's bravery. They framed the letters and photographs, creating a small memorial in the cottage to preserve her story. The truth was painful, but it also brought them closer together. They realized that sometimes, love means making impossible choices to protect the people who matter most. As Maggie stood in the attic one last time, she felt a sense of peace. The letter from the past had given her family a chance to heal and to finally understand the woman who had sacrificed so much for them. The first time Daniel saw the library, it was by accident. He had been wandering the quiet streets of his town, unable to sleep. The night air carried the scent of distant rain, and the streetlights cast soft golden pools onto the cobblestone sidewalks. Everything was still, the world wrapped in a kind of hush only found in the deepest hours of the night. He turned onto a narrow side street, one he had walked 100 times before, but something was different. Nestled between two old brick buildings where he was certain there had been only an alleyway before stood a library. Its ivy-covered walls seemed ancient, as if they had always been there, unnoticed until now. A single lantern glowed above the entrance, casting a flickering halo of light onto a small wooden sign that read, "Opens only at midnight." Daniel frowned, trying to recall if this place had ever been here before. Surely, he would have noticed a building like this. Libraries weren't exactly popping up overnight, and yet, he stepped forward. The air around the library felt different, thicker, like the quiet itself was waiting. His fingers brushed the cool brass handle of the large wooden door, and at his touch, it creaked open just enough to invite him inside. A part of him hesitated, but another part, the one that loved old books and forgotten places, pulled him forward. The moment he crossed the threshold, warmth enveloped him. Inside, the library was vast, much larger than it seemed from the outside. Towering bookshelves stretched toward a domed ceiling where a massive stained glass skylight bathed everything in soft, blue moonlight. The air smelled of aged paper, candle wax, and something faintly sweet, vanilla, perhaps, or the scent of time itself. He expected a librarian, someone to ask him why he was here, but the place was silent, undisturbed. There was no front desk, no patrons, just an ocean of books waiting in the quiet. Daniel stepped forward, running his fingers along the spines of the nearest shelf. Some books bore familiar titles, but most had no words at all, only symbols in delicate gold script. He tilted his head. How did anyone find a book here if nothing was labeled? Then, something caught his eye. A single book lay open on a wooden reading table, as if waiting for him. He approached slowly, his pulse quickening. The pages were filled with neat handwriting, and then he saw his name, written in ink at the top of the first page. The Life of Daniel Everett. His breath hitched. His fingers hovered above the pages before he turned one, hesitantly. The words before him weren't just a story, they were his story. Every chapter, every memory, written down in perfect detail. The day he learned to ride a bike, the summer he spent by the lake with his grandfather, the first time he fell in love. His childhood fears, his moments of triumph, the quiet evenings spent alone with only his thoughts. But, as he turned more pages, he froze. The book didn't stop at the present day. It continued forward, filled with events that hadn't happened yet. Conversations he had never had, places he had never been. His future, unwritten in his own hand. His heart pounded as he skimmed through the paragraphs, searching for something, anything that would tell him what was coming next. Some of the words blurred as he read, shifting like ink that hadn't fully dried. They were waiting for him to live them. And then, at the very end, a final page. Unlike the others, this one was nearly blank except for a single line at the bottom. "What will you choose next?" Daniel swallowed. A rustling sound broke the silence. He looked up sharply. The library remained still, but something felt different. The bookshelves seemed taller now, stretching further into the shadows. The soft blue light from the skylight flickered, as if the moon itself had blinked. His pulse quickened. He could leave now. Close the book. Walk out the door. Forget this strange, hidden place. Pretend it had been a dream. Or he could stay. Slowly, he reached for a pen lying beside the book. The moment his fingers curled around it, a gentle warmth spread through his hand, up his arm, settling into his chest. It felt right, as if the library itself approved of his decision. He leaned forward, pressing ink to paper. As he wrote, something in the library shifted. It wasn't movement, exactly, but a feeling like 1,000 pages turning all at once, an exhale of something ancient and knowing. He glanced up at the shelves again. Were they always this endless? He had a strange sense that they stretched beyond the walls of this building, beyond this town, beyond time itself. How many others had stood where he stood now, writing their own futures? He thought back to the nights he had spent wondering what was next, feeling lost in the uncertainty of life. But here, with ink and paper, he had a choice. Not just to read what was written, but to shape what would come. Daniel paused, staring at the words he had just written. They felt true. They felt like his. A deep calm settled over him, unlike anything he had felt before. It was as if the library itself had wrapped around him. Not just a building, but a presence watching, waiting, guiding. Somewhere beyond the skylight, the night deepened, wrapping the world in its quiet embrace. The weight of time, of choices and untold stories, felt lighter now. Daniel let out a slow breath. The library had been waiting for him all along, and now, he knew why. Ella had never been on a train like this before. It wasn't the shiny, modern kind that zipped across the landscape with speed and purpose. No, this was an old-fashioned train, the kind she imagined in the tales of people long gone. She had been walking through the forest when she stumbled upon the platform, a weathered wooden structure that seemed out of place amidst the trees. A faint hum vibrated in the air, and then she saw it. The train was there, waiting. Its sleek, silver body gleamed under the moonlight, with windows that reflected the starry sky. Despite its age, it seemed untouched by time, as though it had never been used. No one else stood around to board it, just her. Ella hesitated. There was something both unsettling and inviting about the train. It was silent, like a secret waiting to be shared. The air around her seemed still, as though time itself was holding its breath. She glanced at the platform again, unsure whether she should board or leave. But the train, it called to her. There was a quiet pull deep within her chest. She stepped onto the platform, her footsteps soft on the wood. As she reached for the door handle, it opened automatically, as if it had been waiting for her. Inside, the train was like something out of a dream. The interior was lavish, though the passage of years had worn it down. The velvet seats were soft and welcoming. The soft glow of antique lamps cast long shadows across the narrow aisle. A gentle hum, almost like a lullaby, filled the air. Ella found a seat by the window and sat down. The world outside was dark, the trees long gone, replaced by an endless stretch of night. It was a surreal feeling, like she was moving through a dream, but no sound of movement came from the train. It wasn't as if it was rolling down a track, it felt like it was just floating, suspended in time and space. The longer she sat, the more she realized that the train wasn't simply going nowhere, it was always moving. The trees had vanished, replaced by fields of grass, then desert sands. A quiet fog rolled in, but the train continued without hesitation. Ella glanced at the clock on the wall, but it wasn't moving. Time was frozen. How long had she been on this train? Minutes, hours, days, it was impossible to tell. The stillness around her was both peaceful and unnerving. As she gazed out the window, she saw fleeting glimpses of faces, ghostly figures that appeared only for a second before vanishing. People standing at the edge of fields, walking through fog, all with their faces turned away from the train. The figures never came closer, never waved. They were like echoes, remnants of another time. Yet there was a sense of familiarity. a sense that she, too, was part of this strange journey. Her heartbeat quickened. The train had no destination, no end in sight. Where was it going? Where had it been? A soft voice broke through the stillness. "Would you like some tea?" Ella turned her head. The voice belonged to an elderly woman, seated across the aisle. She had silver hair pulled back into a neat bun, her face lined with time. A kindly smile rested on her lips. Without waiting for an answer, the woman stood and moved toward a small trolley, rolling it down the narrow aisle. The sound of the wheels glided along the floor, gentle and soft, like the whispers of the train itself. "Don't worry," the woman said with a warm chuckle as she poured the tea. "The train will never stop, but it will take you where you need to go." Ella's gaze shifted to the window. The world outside had changed once again, now a vast, open sky, clouds drifting lazily by. A soft breeze whispered through the cracks in the train, bringing with it the scent of jasmine and fresh rain. "Where do you think it's taking me?" Ella asked softly, her voice barely more than a whisper. The woman paused, handing her a delicate porcelain cup. "It's not about the destination. It's about the journey. Time is a cycle, not a straight line. Here, you're free to travel wherever your heart needs to go." Ella took the cup in her hands, the warmth seeping into her skin. She looked down at the tea, steam curling up from the surface in intricate patterns. She could feel her body relax, her breath steadying. The train continued its journey, through landscapes that were ever-changing but always calm. It crossed over rivers that sparkled under the moon, climbed mountains where the air was thin and cool, and passed through meadows filled with blooming flowers that danced in the breeze. As she sipped the tea, a sense of peace washed over her. There was no hurry, there was no destination. The world outside might be endless, but inside the train, there was only the present, a quiet eternity that felt like the safest place in the universe. She closed her eyes, feeling the steady hum of the train beneath her, the rhythmic sound of the wheels turning, the gentle sway of the carriage, lulled her into a sense of calm she hadn't known in years. The faces outside the window came and went, each one a reminder that life was a series of moments fading in and out like fleeting dreams. The train didn't stop, it never would, and that was okay. Ella let go of the questions. The answers weren't needed here. For now, there was only the peace of the endless ride, the soft, melodic hum of a journey that would go on forever. And for the first time, Ella smiled, her mind at ease, her body relaxed. She closed her eyes, drifting into the quiet embrace of the night. The train would never stop, and neither would she. Lena had always been a night wanderer. While the world slept, she found peace in the quiet hum of the city, its dim streetlights painting soft glows on the empty sidewalks. Tonight was no different. Wrapped in her coat, she strolled aimlessly, her breath forming misty clouds in the crisp night air. She turned a corner and stopped. There, nestled between two towering buildings, was a cafe she had never seen before. It was small, almost hidden, its sign gently swinging in the night breeze. "The cafe that serves dreams," it read in elegant gold lettering. The windows glowed with a warm, inviting light, and a faint melody soft, wistful piano notes drifted from within. Curious, Lena pushed open the door. A bell chimed softly overhead, and the scent of freshly brewed coffee and something sweet filled her senses. The cafe was unlike any she had been to. The walls were lined with shelves filled with old books, their spines worn from use. Delicate chandeliers cast a golden glow over the round wooden tables, where a few patrons sat in comfortable silence, sipping their drinks. An elderly man behind the counter looked up as she entered, his face creased with gentle wisdom. He wore a simple vest over a white shirt, his sleeves neatly rolled up. "Welcome, traveler," he said, his voice soothing. "A first-time visitor, I see." Lena hesitated but stepped closer. "I didn't know this cafe existed. I walk this street often." The old man smiled knowingly. "That's because it only appears when it's needed. And only to those who are searching for something whether they realize it or not." A strange shiver ran down her spine, but it wasn't unpleasant. There was something magical about this place, something timeless. She glanced at the chalkboard menu behind the counter, but unlike a normal cafe, it didn't list coffee or tea. Instead, it had words like serenity, lost memory, courage, closure. Lena frowned. What kind of cafe is this? One that serves what your heart desires most. The man replied, Tell me, what do you seek tonight? She hesitated, unsure how to answer. The past few months had been a blur of sleepless nights, tangled thoughts, and a persistent sense of something missing. She had tried to move forward, but something unseen always held her back. Peace, she murmured. I think I need peace. The old man nodded and turned toward the rows of delicate porcelain cups behind him. He selected one, a midnight blue cup with silver patterns swirling like constellations. With careful hands, he filled it from an ornate silver kettle. A fragrant steam curled into the air, carrying a scent Lena couldn't quite place, something familiar yet distant, like a forgotten lullaby. He set the cup before her. Drink, and let the cafe do the rest. Lena hesitated for only a moment before lifting the cup to her lips. The warmth spread through her, settling deep in her chest. As she swallowed, the cafe around her seemed to shift. The soft piano music grew distant, and the golden glow of the chandeliers dimmed. The air became lighter, almost weightless. Then, she was somewhere else. She stood in a field of tall grass, swaying under a sky of endless stars. A gentle breeze brushed her cheek, carrying whispers she couldn't quite understand. In the distance, a figure appeared, a young woman, her features blurred by time. Lena's breath caught in her throat. She knew this place, and she knew that figure. It was her mother, standing just as she had in one of Lena's earliest memories. She had been so small then, grasping her mother's hand as they watched the fireflies dance. But this wasn't just a memory, it was something more. The air hummed with quiet energy, as if the past and present had entwined in this single moment. Her mother turned, smiling softly. You've been searching for something, my love. But you never lost it. It's been with you all along. Lena's eyes burned, but no tears fell. A deep, quiet warmth filled her chest, soothing the ache she hadn't realized she carried. The field around her blurred, and the gentle hum of the cafe returned. She blinked. The porcelain cup was still in her hands, now empty. The cafe was just as it had been, the quiet melody still playing, the golden glow still warm. The old man watched her with knowing eyes. Did you find what you were looking for? He asked softly. Lena exhaled, a deep and steady breath. Yes. She placed the cup down carefully, as if waking from a dream she didn't want to forget. Standing, she reached into her pocket, but the old man shook his head. Payment isn't necessary here, he said. Just remember, this cafe will always be here when you need it. Lena nodded, her heart lighter than it had been in years. As she stepped outside, the crisp night air greeted her. She turned, expecting to see the cafe's warm glow behind her, but it was gone. Only the quiet street remained, the stars twinkling above. She stood there for a moment, then smiled softly to herself. The cafe might have vanished, but its warmth remained within her, settling deep into the places that had once been cold. And for the first time in a long while, Lena felt at peace. As she walked home, she knew she would sleep soundly tonight.